thank you to all of you. It's been a very long day, but this will make it better, I hope. I just wanted to say something a little bit personal. I came here for the first time in 1981 during Solidarność, when you could buy an interview with Lech Wałęsa for a carton of Dunhills, which seemed fine to me. And I stayed in this hotel, naturally, which was a very different hotel, pretty wired. Maybe it's still wired, I don't know, possibly. And then came back under martial law when I bought Polish clothes so I could ride the trams and look a bit less like a foreigner. One of my favorite lines in Master and Margarita is when the devil comes to Moscow to Patriarch's Pond, and Bulgakov writes, they knew he was a foreigner because of his shoes. So I was very conscious of that. And then I came here also for the Pope's second visit, Pope John Paul II. It's one of the most moving things that I ever covered. Again, in this hotel, where for the event of the Pope's trip, there was a direct line to London. And as soon as the Pope left, so did the line. It was cut off. Anyway, we have, I think, a wonderful panel to discuss this topic. I think the topic, as Dove and I were talking earlier, feels like a pre-war title, player or playground. I mean, of course, it's both, but I think these days it's maybe less of a playground than a sort of battleground. It's a strategic space right now, Europe. Francois Heisbourg reminded us last night that when Sweden and Finland get in, when they finally pacify Mr. Erdogan, 23 of the EU's 27 members will be part of NATO, and that's pretty remarkable. So we'll see what that means for our title, because after all, the EU was designed to be something different. I mean, it really was about economics, it was about trade. It was really a place for former empires, empires that had failed, and small states that came out of those empires to bind themselves together in the interests of no more war. So asking the EU, which is committed to no more war, to suddenly start having a big defense autonomy, whatever you want to call it, what, as an American, I don't like autonomy, call it strategic partnership, is a big ask. It's important, it may slowly happen, but it hasn't happened not just out of reluctance, but because, of course, of the amour propre of big states who want their own defense industries, they want their own foreign policies. But we are in a fascinating moment of change, opportunity, though it does remind me, and here I'll stop, of a famous Russian comedian who once said, you know, everything's changed, but nothing's different. He said, unless everything's different, but nothing's changed. So this is our task. So I'm going to ask our panel to start thinking with me about what Europe is now, how it plays its role, is it changing? And no one better to start than Heather, the new leader of the German Marshall Fund.
Steve, thank you so much. It's great to be with everyone. I agree with you. The title did seem a little pre-February 24th because it is a strategic space. And specifically, the United States has now had to much more fully re-enter that strategic space. But it re-enters the space with a lot of expectation that our European allies will do more. Will provide greater defensive capabilities within NATO. And it also has a high level expectation that the European Union will strengthen itself, whether it's overcoming the 6th round of sanctions and being able to do the most difficult thing, which is sacrificing your own economy for your values and your principles. It's looking at the European Union infrastructure. For several years, the European Union and NATO have been working on a military mobility project. Has made some steps, important steps, but if we have to really reinforce the eastern flank, we still aren't there with roads and bridges, because that's a civilian capability that the European Union has to be a part of, as well as the individual member states. We're seeing the EU certainly on disinformation, which is a key role, very important step. The EU playing a big role in anti-money laundering, illicit financing, and it's been particularly gratifying to see a much more focused effort on eliminating Russian illicit financing through European and American banks. So as much as the European Union, when Ursula von der Leyen became Commission President, talking about a geopolitical commission, that rhetorical aspect, well, the times, the geopolitical times, do demand the European Union and NATO to play a greater role. But I'll end here, Steve. Perhaps, and ironically for an American, the greatest role that the EU will play geostrategically will come in June, when it must decide to give candidate status to Ukraine. And I say that because for the first time, process now has geopolitical ramifications. And as much as the EU's process is maddening to an American because it's very complex, it's hard for us to understand, that process has the biggest geopolitical impact. And if that decision isn't made, I think it speaks to us that the European Union may not be the geopolitical actor it aspires to be.
Okay, just let me follow that up for 1 second, because of course it is a process. It's very complicated. I mean, Zelensky's filled out some forms. Clearly, the Commission has dumped it in the lap of the European Council, right? I expect accession will open, but what happens then? I mean, is it going to take 5 years, 10 years? I mean, or is it a lie? This is the serious question. And if it's a lie, what's the impact of the lie?
So I see the June decision doing two things immediately. Number one, it gives the Ukrainian people hope that their sacrifice has a future. So just that strong message that they are a member of Europe. And that process has begun. The second important issue is actually it's not a signal necessarily to the government. It's a signal to civil society. They want the processes to help them with anti-corruption, transparency, accountability, good governance. They need that process to be successful. So even if it does not conclude, and we have no idea, we have a window over the next 2 to 3 months where we have to support the Ukrainian military and Ukraine economically to survive the next couple months, and we have to give them this hope on candidate status. So even if it doesn't go anywhere, what needs to happen is so important for June, July, this window of opportunity.
Great, thank you. I do want to come back to this idea a bit later, but Shuvaloy, over to you.
Well, I don't know if I want to contribute more in terms of what the European Union as an institution is capable of accomplishing in the coming months, but I think it's critical the choices they'll make. I think of Europe as a collection of a few arrangements. As the European Union, the European Council, their expanding membership and role with NATO, and of course the collection of member states that make sovereign decisions on their own interests. And in preparation for this discussion, I was trying to think about two ways to categorize some of these states. What we've seen Europe and their member states become are subjected to becoming a playground for authoritarian ambitions, whether they are subjected to invasion like they are in Ukraine, disinformation or cyber attacks, or commercial corrosion in Western capitals especially, or whether they are being put under the thumb of the Belt and Road Initiative and chasing entreaties by Beijing for a deeper economic partnership as a customer and a client. And so, in my mind, European states fall into two categories. You have the more promiscuous states, if I could call it that way, that, like France, Germany, Italy, a BRI partner, Georgia, Hungary, bring various levels of ambition to their promiscuity with authoritarian regimes. And then you have a new center of strategic focus coming from Europe that is driven by conviction leadership. And you see that in the Baltics. You see it among the Czechs, Poland, obviously, and more recently, Sweden and Finland, who seek to define a different understanding of what Europe's mutual security needs and requirements are. And the reason I think of Europe as member states and what their ambitions are is because I do not believe that there can be the accomplishment of mutual prosperity without a common understanding of mutual security. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine certainly has brought focus to one element of that peril to European security. But I think that we have a long way to go to define what Chinese threats are in, the PRC's threats are in Europe.
Great. I like you've invented a whole new metaphor, being under the thumb of the Belt and Road. That's good, I like that.
Coming from a writer, they'll take it.
Okay. I mean, I do want to come back to China too, because I mean, I don't want this all to be about Russia, but it just seems to me one of the things you have these big states doing is recognizing the economic power of the European Union, which controls trade in all these countries, 450 million people, some of the richest people in the world, richer than my people in the United States per capita, and wanting to divide up that power just to deal with each state, because they're much bigger than each separate state. So one sees this constantly in social media, one sees it in lots of other ways, Belt and Road, 17+1, just efforts to pull countries aside. Do you think, quickly, the Ukraine war, the invasion of Ukraine, will that be a wake-up call on China too, do you think, inside Europe?
I'm not sure the Ukraine war, the war in Ukraine by Russia, has been a sufficient wake-up call to Western European leaders who are continuing to experiment with various versions of appeasement. That's with respect to Moscow's invasion. And so when you think about what China's entreaties are to Europe, looking at it from a Beijing state-owned kind of perspective, you would have seen the European project, perhaps this might be unpopular in this room, but you would have seen the European project disproportionately benefiting Germany. What we have seen is that high debt and unemployment in the European South has made German productivity and manufacturing cheaper, offering a boost in exports and drawing jobs and draining jobs out of Italy, Spain, and elsewhere. It's converting the European South into, on one side, retirement community for rich Northerners, and on the other, holding camps for migrants. And so when you think of that from a Beijing perspective, you see that there's a great opportunity to pick up assets to promise economic opportunity on their terms as the senior, bigger partner, displacing what a bad arrangement has been for so many of those southern states.
Okay, thank you. Dov, over to you.
Well, as I was listening to this, my first thought was, you may have problems with people bugging your room. I don't, because there's nothing to bug. It's all boring. A couple of thoughts. Actually, the word playground may be a good one, at least in Putin's mind. I think Putin thought it was a playground. He saw some members of NATO that clearly were now becoming outliers, whether it's Turkey or Hungary, to some extent Greece. He saw the United States at war with itself. That has not gone away. He saw Britain leaving the EU. And so he thought, well, they didn't stop me before. That's kind of like a playground. Of course, it's changed. And Europe is front and center. My concern is that it's front and center for now, particularly for the United States. the last national defense strategy and national security strategy a few years ago basically said China was the long-term threat. You mentioned China. And Russia was kind of a near-term threat. It was clearly second rank. And my concern is that from all the reporting that you and your colleagues have made about the latest national defense and national security strategy, that hasn't changed very much. I think it's a huge mistake. I thought it was a huge mistake when it first came out some years ago, because the equipment that Putin was buying, and is still buying, by the way, hypersonic weapons, to give one example, it's not going to go away for 20-odd years. That's not a near-term threat. And the notion that even if he stopped in Ukraine, he's just going to give up and walk away is also a mistake, because it's not just Putin, it's Russia. And it's not clear to me that Russia, unlike some of the other empires you were talking about, Russia's not Austria. And so that too may be an underestimate on our part as to what Russia, as opposed to just Putin, is up to. I mean, it's very easy to say, well, you know, it's all Putin, it's one guy, he's running the country, blah, blah, blah. As I tell people, what other country in the world, do veterans walk around all day, and somebody pointed out to me, even in bed with their medals on? There's something about Russian nationalism that I think is not fully comprehended in the West. I'm not saying it's good, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm saying it's different. Then there's another factor that I think I haven't heard anybody talk about. So the EU is going to have this meeting and open a door to Ukraine. What do you think the Turks are going to say? They have been trying to get into the, first it was the EEC, then it was the EC, now it's the EU. They've been trying to get in for the better part of 50 years, going nowhere. And all of a sudden, the EU is going to open its doors wide to Ukraine. And this is the same Turkey that's blocking Sweden and Finland from coming in. And Mr. Erdogan has an election coming up next year and has to win the votes. And how does he calculate his electoral prospects if he just sits there and watches Finland and Sweden come into NATO, Ukraine come into the EU, and everybody wants Turkey to keep the Black Sea closed to the Russians? So that's a calculation, I think, that has to be made. On the positive side, I would argue that if and when, and hopefully when, Sweden and Finland come in, you've got a whole new dimension to NATO, because the Baltic Sea becomes a complete NATO lake. Remember, in the Cold War, it was the other way around. You've got literally a line that begins with the Baltic states and ends at Britain. And that is going to create a certain power to the northern flank, as it's called, that it never had. Those of you who are ancient enough like me may remember that when you visited Norway in the 70s and 80s, their biggest worry was they're going to forget about us. Nobody's going to forget about the northern flank now.
I want to compliment you on your socks also. Which
well,
are,
I'm an American.
Red, white, and blue.
And red, white, and blue with stars and a football on them as well.
It's not just Turkey, of course, because I don't think Ukraine's getting into the EU very soon. It's North Macedonia, it's Albania, which the French have kept from opening accession. So my guess is you'll have a bunch that get opened. Otherwise, it's intolerable. One question I just wanted to ask you, and when you think of Putin's calculus about doing this, do you think when he met Biden in Vienna in June, do you think he sensed weakness there? Was that part of what he wondered?
No, this wasn't like Kennedy and Khrushchev in Vienna, not at all. But I think he saw a president who still had to be justified, not to justify himself, but still had to be justified to roughly half of his own population. And that's still the case. I mean, after all said and done, even when John Adams wouldn't be at Jefferson's inauguration, he didn't say that Jefferson was some kind of fraud and had stolen the election. And so you're sitting in the Kremlin and you're seeing, or you're meeting with this guy that you've known before, by the way, vice president, senator, whose legitimacy is being challenged. How could you possibly think that he would, of all people, be able to organize this group of stray cats called NATO? And not only organize them, but actually have them do something.
Good answer. Przemysław, your turn.
Thank you very much. Well, there are two possible answers to the question in title, the politically correct one and the correct one. The politically correct answer is that Europe, I think we mean European Union, in fact, yeah, under the term, is both the playground and the player. While in my mind, the correct answer is following the ancient philosopher Heraclit of Ephes, that pantarei, having everything is in the course of changes. And European Union of 90s is different than of the first decade of this century, and is different till February 24 and after that. I will give some examples. It used to be a player, while today it's less and less a player and more a playground. When in 2002, the French president Jacques Chirac met Putin in Sochi and promised him extraterritorial corridors across Lithuania to Kaliningrad region, the European Commission said, no, it's not your capacity, Mr. President, to make such a decision, because this is up to European Union Schengen rules. What are the rules to cross the Schengen borders? It's not the French competence to determine this. While a few years ago, when the President of the European Commission, Juncker, was asked why the European Commission is not reacting towards the French violation of budgetary discipline, his answer was parce que c'est la France, because this is France. So I have reminded those two things to show you to what an extent the European institutions used to be able to play some independent role in the past, and how much the situation has been changed since those old times. And if I am to describe the present state of the European Union, I would say that it's asymmetric confederation with unequal members, in which there are two leading powers. That means Germany and France. The second one is weaker and weaker vis-à-vis Germany. I fully agree with what you have said, that after those three crises, that means the financial crisis of the Eurozone, the immigration crisis, and the COVID crisis, the South is less and less influential. Please remember that this belt of heavily indebted countries, from Greece up to Portugal, is really in a very hard economic situation. We have populism, but please remember that there is mainstream populism and anti-mainstream populism. And when the French president says that the common market of services, including transport services, is something that we should regulate in a way to stop one of the four European freedoms, that means to prevent Central European companies from operating freely in France, it's according to the electoral necessity of the mainstream populists and not anti-mainstream populists. Yeah, so, and this is the example of the role of France as a player in the European Union, as a playground. Yeah. The same was about the famous or unfamous statement of Wolfgang Schäuble, one of the most reasonable politicians, who dared to say during the Greek economic crisis, this government or that government, these elections or another elections, referendum or not referendum, Greece will follow the program that is accepted in Frankfurt and Brussels. That means the Greek democracy is a political theater, while real decisions are taken somewhere else, in some other places. So this is the general direction of the evolution of the Union. And as far as those issues that were touched by other panelists, the most important one is, of course, Ukraine. And I would ask the question, reminding you that on June the 12th, there will be the first stage of the French elections, parliamentary elections. And on June 26th, there will be the second stage. And on June 26th, there will be the first day of the European Summit. Do you think that La République En Marche will put at risk its electoral result by publicly giving its consent to the opening of the doors of the European Union for Ukraine? I doubt. One of the most important factors we have to take into consideration while describing politics in the West is that we are all democracies, and our governments want to win next elections. So what is possible, it's only what is acceptable by our electorates, and they are different in different countries. And this is why it is national electorates and national states' interest playground and not an independent player. One more sentence, anecdote. There was a question, is European Union an international actor? Yes, it is, because an actor is a person who pretends to be somebody else that he actually is.
Well, on verra, as they say. Let me ask you about, just quickly about Poland. Do you think, I mean, given that European Union is about shared sovereignty, and that has more attractiveness for some countries than others, is Poland getting more reconciled to the EU or less, do you think?
It depends when and in what the dimension. I think that, of course, the first decade was very important and splendid. Before 2008, European Union was first much more balanced as far as the institutions are concerned. Please remember that the Nice decision-making system was much more favorable for the countries like Poland, and generally much more favorable for the European Union development, because it was based on the overestimation of the smaller states. In the eastern flank, we have only one relatively large state, that means Poland. And please remember that the European Union was enlarged with in 2004 with 38 million of Poles and 36 million of all the other peoples who joined the Union in that year. After that, after 2009, 2017, in fact, because that was the year when the Lisbon Treaty mechanism was put into force, that balance of power was destroyed in favor of large countries. Now, in the context of the Ukrainian war, there is this French and German initiative of European strategic autonomy, the French one, and European strategic suzerainty. But the core idea inside those initiatives is to have the qualified majority voting in the foreign policy issues. I will give you one example. What does it mean? It means that in June 2021, France and Germany would have invited Putin to the European Union summit unless they are stopped by less powerful countries like Poland, Scandinavians, Balts, and so on. Yeah, so this is really danger direction of developments.
No, because I mean, one of the things one learns is that, you know, French-German couple, which they don't actually like each other very much, and they actually disagree with quite a lot, but they are no longer even sufficient anymore on their own, but nothing happens without them. So that's important. One thing, I just want to throw this open to anyone who wants to answer. One of the things that interests me, maybe it's bizarre of me, but indulge me, is what responsibility does the EU have to countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia? Is it different now? I mean, can there be some kind of structure that isn't necessarily membership, because that could take 10 years, you know, that binds them somehow to Europe, that doesn't leave them in the borderlands, and what's possible? What do you think? I mean, don't you?
Well, there's actually a precedent, and I wrote about it quite a while ago in The Hill. East Germany was an honorary member of the European Community via Germany. There was a separate deal, you remember this, of course, separate deal with West Germany to allow them to essentially have a free trade area with the East, which meant that the East had a free trade area with the rest of the EU. That kind of deal is doable. By the way, a deal like that, which if coupled with a free trade area with Russia, might be one inducement to sort of bring this thing to some kind of end if a lot of other things were sorted out. But yeah, it is doable. What is not doable without Ukraine coming into the EU is that article in the Lisbon Treaty that Carl Bildt, a friend of many of us, says
42.7.
42.7, that essentially says any member of the EU will come to the defense of any other member that is a victim of aggression. And Carl says that's even stronger than Article 5, because that is actually a lineal descendant of the Brussels Treaty, which meant you were automatically at war with anybody who was attacked among those 7 countries. That ain't the Article 5. Article 5 still requires all those legislatures. That will not happen if Ukraine is not in the EU, and may well be one of the reasons why Russia bitterly opposed Ukraine going into, people say, well, the EU is only an economic thing. It's not. And that's something that we tend to overlook.
Because, I mean, after all, what was the Maidan about but the association agreement with the EU? Heather?
Well, I think in many ways this argues for a reconceptualization of Europe, and I would argue a transatlantic European policy. Let's be clear, this thing has been in a form of stagnation for 10 to 15 years. Now, post-February 24th, now this is a completely different environment. So this is where this dreamed of geopolitical commission, we're ready. Now you have to really think strategically. There is the process dynamic, which, as I said again, I think is extraordinarily helpful, but there has to now be a real purpose to outcome. There has to be security. There has to be economics. There has to be a very strong civil society component. We have to invest in this region, literally and figuratively, for the next decade, 2 decades. This is long-term policy to basically restabilize Europe's security order. As Dov was saying, that takes an investment from the United States that has not been thought through, because obviously focusing so much on the day-to-day, it has not been conceptualized within the EU, and you're absolutely right. I think the distinction here is the Europe that we are talking about has shifted dramatically east, and that is a different Europe strategically. That moves it away from Paris's own objectives and interests. It challenges certainly the southern flank, which again, one of the tragic consequences of this war is a global food crisis, which could bring even greater instability to the south as well. So this is why it has to be rethought very quickly. And I think it's telling that for Ukraine, we do not have agreed transatlantic policy outcome. We talk about winning. Winning has no definition. Winning for some is a ceasefire in a frozen conflict. Winning for others is removal of Russian forces from the territory of Ukraine. What's in between? So this is where, again, the geopolitics, Eastern policy, Europe is an eastward leaning organization which will have different strategic requirements.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that worries me sometimes is everyone says, oh, the Ukrainians have to decide what the final settlement is, and then on the next hand, they say, Russia must be defeated. And the two may not be the same. And some say, oh, you have to drive Russia all the way out, but the last thing Zelensky said was back to 2014. So we have to think this through and not, you know, promise more than we can deliver, but not expect more than is possible. I mean, this is difficult. I mean, glad it's not my responsibility, but I think we have to be a little less schizophrenic. If we believe it's up to Ukrainians, then we have to listen to them and not just tell them what to do. Anyway, Shuv, did you want to come in on this idea of any European responsibility or even transatlantic responsibility for these countries who are clearly vulnerable but belong to nothing right now?
I would say 75 years into the post-war order, all of the institutions designed to govern it are now apocalyptically afire. 2 of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are shredding treaties and norms, whether it's the Sino-UK protections around Hong Kong to the Budapest Memorandum guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty.
Assuring.
Mm-hmm.
Assuring Ukraine.
Assuring. It's an
Different
important
thing.
word.
I apologize.
No, I appreciate it. It's an important word. It belies a bit of the intention around what the partners had intended for Ukraine. What I think we are beginning to rediscover now as the Indo-Pacific rises, not just China, but others in the